Welcome to the Diversity in STEM podcast, where we interview leaders in the fields of science, technology, engineering, and mathematics to help inspire students of all ages. My name is Joe Kent, and I'm the Director of Education for the National Atomic Testing Museum. In 2015, according to the National Science Foundation's Science and Engineering Indicators 2018 report, women accounted for less than 1/3 of science and engineering employment, despite accounting for 1/2 of the college-educated workforce. The NSF is an independent federal agency created by Congress in 1950, quote, to promote the progress of science, to advance the national health, prosperity, and welfare, to secure the national defense, end quote. This data seems to show that while more women are studying STEM-related subjects in school, considerable effort needs to be made to ensure that 50-50 split continues into the workplace. To speak about the current experiences of women in STEM careers, we've gathered together 4 distinguished guests that may be familiar to regular listeners of this podcast. Hello, thank you all so much for being here. Now, for those that may not know, how did each of you end up in the STEM fields? And feel free to jump right in.
Well, I'm first on the list. I'm Julie Mitchell. I'll go ahead. My story into STEM, let's see. I went to college and I signed up as a business major. I didn't exactly know what I wanted to do. And I took one economics class in which I got an A, but it wasn't for me. You know, I needed something different. So I liked math and chemistry the most. And chemistry had afternoon labs when I worked, and math had 32 free elective units that I could spend on art history class. And the rest is history.
Thank you, Dr. Mitchell. Dr. Julie Mitchell is the director of the Biosciences Division at Oak Ridge National Laboratory.
Yeah, I can jump in next. I am Dr. Asuna, and I got into science just kind of as a natural fit. I was always interested in the outdoors and in extreme weather, and I excelled in math. And so even though I was never exposed to kind of careers in science and technology, it just seemed like I couldn't even picture another job. So luckily I had people that helped me to make that a reality.
Thank you, Dr. Asuna. Dr. Jessica Asuna is the group leader for atmospheric science research and applications and an operations scientist at the National Atmospheric Release Advisory Center at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory.
Hi. Okay. Go ahead, Karen.
I'll go next. I'm Karen Schouk. And if I remember about 50 decades ago how it was to go into the mathematics field, and when you asked me this before, the answer is the same. There really wasn't anything else that I could have fit into. It was just a go forward with the computations, and it fit very nicely. I went to the University of Illinois. It was back in the day, 50 decades ago, called Champaign-Urbana. Now it's called Urbana-Champaign. And began a math computer science program there. It just seemed like the thing that fit. There was no magic. There was no stress. That's just what it was.
Thank you, Dr. Schlauch. Dr. Karen Schouk is an adjunct professor in the Pharmacology department at the University of Nevada at Reno and genetic statistician for the Healthy Nevada Project with the Desert Research Institute.
Hi, this is Shanna. So I was always interested as a teenager in 2 sort of topics. One of them was virology. I had seen Outbreak. I thought it was a fascinating movie, and it was something that I was interested in doing, and also environmental conservation. I think I had some early on science teachers who did sort of modules in environmental science and conservation, and I sort of decided, okay, I want to do something in those 2 fields when I got to university. And ultimately, I ended up going into environmental engineering. That was, to some degree, something my parents wanted me to pursue because they thought that engineering would open up more job opportunities. So I chose environmental because it sort of allowed me to combine those 2 things. And then that just from there sort of slowly and inadvertently ended up driving me towards a field where I could do infectious disease research, but it was sort of happenstance and coincidental and not necessarily what I started out doing, even though in the end I kind of came full circle and ended up doing the kind of work that was sort of demonstrated in movies like Outbreak that I was fascinated in high school. So I'm fortunate that I ended up in sort of that same position, but it was sort of in a weird way.
Thank you, Dr. Ratnesar-Shumate. Dr. Shauna Ratnassar-Shumate is an associate professor and research scientist in the Department of Pathology and Microbiology at the University of Nebraska Medical Center and scientist with the National Strategic Research Institute. So thank you all so much again. So that gives us a little introduction to some of the newer listeners. Now, with our introduction, we talk a lot about, there's a lot of women studying these fields in school, but they're clearly facing some sort of challenge in the workplace in that transition. So have any of you had any difficulties or challenges being a woman in school or in your career, and how did you navigate those difficulties?
Well, I'll start. So engineering fields, I think, traditionally have been dominated by men. I was fortunate, University of Florida at the time that I attended, which was around 1998 was when I started there. The College of Engineering at UF was actually a 51% female to male ratio. So I think that it was quite diverse at the time, and I don't think there were really any struggles in college in terms of being a woman and going through that curriculum. But definitely when I graduated and started working, especially in a field, so I started out my career as a defense contractor, and I've spent most of my career as a defense contractor. And I think because the military institutions to some degree are a little bit late to that equality and recognition of those struggles, I definitely experienced for years all kinds of very subtle discrimination, but just even being one of only, the only female on teams that are largely male, and just having a different perspective or different opportunities. I think when I did my original podcast with you, I talked about being out in a military installation and there was no women's bathroom anywhere nearby. I had to walk for a very long time to get to the only women's restroom. And so little things like that, where just having accommodations for women was an afterthought, are some of the smaller struggles. And I think the biggest struggles have been as a mother and having children and still trying to maintain myself as competitive in the workforce. And that's where I've struggled a lot in making decisions about what's right for myself and for my career, but also right for my family, and having to feel torn between making those decisions.
Absolutely. I remember you mentioning that, absolutely, talking about just, little things like that are completely unexpected and make you feel like an outsider in a lot of ways, right? And so how about the rest of you? Any similar experiences to Shauna?
Yeah, I'll first of all, hats off to her, because I went to also University of Illinois for undergraduate, and at the time I was initially an engineer, because that was as she said, that was something that anybody was kind of familiar with, that there would be a lot of jobs. And I was one of the very few women. And for me, it's kind of hard to disentangle some of the factors that might have contributed to my experience between being from a rural town, lower middle class, blue collar, minority, and woman. It's hard to disentangle for me. But whatever the factors were, I definitely felt completely out of sorts and intimidated by my surroundings in engineering, especially in aerospace engineering that had largely kind of a wealthy suburban male cohort. And I felt like everybody had so much more experience than me, and therefore I wasn't cut out for it. So I did end up changing my major out of engineering. But beyond that, I would say, similar to what Shanna said, it's the biggest challenge has been being a mother. And I think that now, hopefully with the latest generation of parents, some of the men, and I think we'll touch on this more later also, have taken on a larger role in parenting, and that has influenced, but in my time, it was still largely me taking a lot of the role of parenting on my own. And so that created a challenge to, exactly as Shanna said, I made a note of it, of figuring out what the right decision was, figuring out where the right balance was, what I was willing to sacrifice at home and at work. But largely I'm lucky because once I became a professional and started at Lawrence Livermore, I have had incredibly supportive management and staff and people who know that somebody who has a healthy balance, whatever that means to them in life, will be a better employee. So I'm very lucky at this stage.
I'm happy to jump in, and I'm not somebody with children, but I'm going to second what the other women have said, just based on knowing many women that the leaky pipeline, that's a big factor. And I'll second, I was grew up in mathematics departments and was a math professor, and there is an alienation. Engineering, I think, is among the very worst in terms of how women feel, and also the kind of upper middle class aspects too. So, anyway, but I'll tell maybe a different story about, what happens when, how do you get out of a situation that feels really bad to you? And so I was interviewing for faculty positions, and, I won't name the name or the place and then so on, but I had a very powerful department chairman in the middle of our interview stop and say, you're a very attractive woman. I don't know what I was expecting from a mathematician. So this was somebody outside of mathematics, but you're quite pretty. So what do you do? Right. And so I made I said something about, balancing brains and beauty. And by the way, I wanted to tell you about this research project, because we've been chit-chatting and, he's talking about, hobbies and whatever. And I didn't shut up about research for the entire rest of the time. And so, I don't know the solution to all problems, but if you ever find yourself in a situation like that, my advice is, if you can go all business, do that. So, and
that's it just highlights I think, like, it's such a different experience. That's not something that would happen to a man in that field, and so and I'm glad you and thank you, Dr. Julie, for mentioning that story. And do any of you also have a story that either similar or that you'd be willing to share, just talking about those experiences where it's those on the outside maybe aren't familiar with, and just highlighting those challenges in the workplace? We talk a lot about STEM in school, but also when you get into that field, and it's a different scenario, a different situation.
I would just say it is surprising to me, having been in the workforce for so long. It is interesting to me how many people feel okay to comment about your looks, and it usually does come from men. It does, women aren't. Women will, I like your outfit today, or that's a great handbag, or where did you get those shoes? Men will say something like, oh, isn't she a pretty girl? Or I've even had, this is talking about the next generation. I had a colleague recently come into my office after a group barbecue and tell me, your daughter is beautiful. She'll just be able to marry somebody wealthy. And I'm like, or she can go to school, get an education, and support herself, because looks aren't everything, right? And so it's funny to me that this day and age, you still find it appropriate to compliment women. And, in some ways, my mother always gets mad at me when I tell her these stories, because I will say she's a little bit more old fashioned, but I want to be known for my accomplishments as a scientist, as an engineer, to be an equal in the workplace, and not have my looks or my aesthetics or any of that be sort of a factor in it, because it's not a factor for men. And so it is interesting that men do that. And yeah, I've had similar things where, oh, well, you're the new hot scientist or something said to me. And I'm like, what does that have to do with anything I just brought up in this conversation? We're talking about respect. And so it's still happening.
And it's just awful to hear, because we think we make so much progress, right? But those still crop up. They crop up in the museum field, and I've seen it happen. And it's not unique, certainly, but I think it does highlight the fact that we need to normalize the experience of women in science and other STEM fields, and say that they're on equal footing. don't ask them or comment on things that you wouldn't necessarily do, to a man, right? So it's getting that, we're not there yet because it's not, because they do make it an exception or bring it up and make a comment on the differences. And I think that's where we're not quite there. And I think, Karen, you wanted to jump in as well?
Yeah, I wanted to say something about equal opportunity and aesthetics. So my mother who was my biggest supporter, but also not in the mathematics field, she would often chide me and my husband, back then fiance, who was also a PhD in mathematics. And she would say, nobody's going to take you seriously and think that you're a professor if you dress like that, kids. Because why not? Look at us now. I mean, we didn't get hired for the way we dress or the way we look. We got hired for our brains. But in that generation, looks are still, or the way you dress are still very important. You see that when you fly, for example. Older people tend to dress a little bit nicer and when they fly or when they travel. But for us, it was just so funny. So that is an equal opportunity statement that was given to both me and my husband, who honestly dresses much worse than I do.
And I think, Jessica, you had a comment as well?
Yeah, I was just going to add, many people have all kinds of different struggles and for different motivations. And not just, like I said before, there's a lot of these compounding factors, but I think a lot of people who maybe don't fit the mold of a scientist, whether that be a white guy who's really into tattoos and rock music on the side or something, or whether it be, in my case, I've always been a dancer growing up. And so during college, similar to what Shanna said, during college, I participated in a hip hop dance group, and we would perform at different campus events and all of these things. And I had a professor once walk through the quad where we were performing and saw me. And later he called me in for a meeting and said to me, this is when I was an undergrad and I was trying to get more experience as a researcher to go on to grad school. And he said, if you really want to be taken seriously, you're going to have to let go of all of this dancing stuff and this other stuff, because once somebody sees you as a sexy dancer, you can't be seen as anything serious anymore. And I wasn't doing sexy dancing, first of all. Like, it was, a co-ed group of doing, just dancing and having fun and staying active and helping and trying to keep balance, right? And so, yeah, that was kind of my first foray into deciding, okay, am I going to change to fit the mold, or am I just going to kill them with kindness and keep doing me,
Right. And it's one facet of our, what we do, what we're studying is one facet of our personalities. It's not the only thing that defines us. And we all crave that ability to express ourselves. And I think it's okay to have those. You can't just be seen at one thing all the time. It's okay to have those, different experiences, different hobbies as well, things that you're passionate about. And I think talking about these stories as we get into the next topic, just talking about what are some of the societal norms, whether they're cultural, societal, regional, or familial, that you feel contributed to either the difficulties or your successes as you worked along the path in your respective careers. What do you think are some of those norms that reinforce that?
I feel like I'm dominating, but I'll jump in first and I'll be short. I will say that my family values and hometown kind of culture definitely contributed to my success. I am really lucky that, even though neither of my parents had a college education, and they're, blue collar workers, they definitely encouraged me to break the mold and encourage, if I was going to do well in school, that was what they were proudest of me for. But they never forced me to choose between, like, for example, dancing or music or academics. They just let me explore it all and encouraged me. And they were really kind of intrigued at getting an inside view of another part of the world through me. And so they always encouraged me and pushed me, and just kind of went along the ride. And my mother, my father always supported me and encouraged me, but my mother was like behind closed door, behind my back, she was secretly helping to kind of make sure that my environment during high school was going to be as conducive to me doing this. And she would make phone calls and say, for example, I was in marching band, but I also was a dancer, and they wouldn't let anybody participate in both because they conflicted. And so she said, no, let her give it a try. Let her break the mold and just do it. And, so she was always pushing me to just not go by other people's idea of what was okay, and just go.
Absolutely. Yeah. That's a big part of it, right? Is, part of the reason why we started this podcast was, to have this as a resource for parents and teachers to find out how they can support, their children if they're interested in the STEM fields and pursuing those careers, is to get them to find the resources, do all that stuff to then be extra supportive, right? So yeah. And Karen, go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to say that there were no gender or ethnic barriers in my family. Both of my parents were academics. They didn't care what we did as long as we were happy. Both of them were in the literature and history fields, and they didn't understand that their two daughters were in the engineering and mathematics field. So every time we did something or wrote a project, they would write it down on a little note card, like my PhD dissertation title or my master's dissertation title, so that they could understand what we were doing. They still do this to this day. It's really nice that they try to live through us in a different dimension. But as we were growing up, and I too grew up in a very small community in the cornfields of Illinois, there were at the time really no gender barriers. I didn't realize that there were any, that I couldn't be a woman in mathematics. I didn't know that I would ever face any academic bullying or gender bullying, or that I would have any of these gender barriers. So maybe that's because we grew up in a family where we were very liberal and we accepted everyone, but I don't know. Maybe I was just lucky. I'm not sure, but we grew up with no barriers in sight. So we just put on our boots and kicked ass and moved forward.
That's amazing. And Julie, go ahead.
Sure. So I grew up in the Silicon Valley, which was very nice because, for example, we had computers in the schools that Apple would give us, and we had programming classes and things like that. And so, I felt like the local environment was sort of pretty good for STEM. My family situation's unusual in that, my mom died when I was young, so I was raised by my father, and I was a feisty child and learned at an early age how to hold my own against strong-willed men. And as strange as it may seem, I feel like that's been an advantage in my career because it's a skill that I've needed at times. So anyway, I don't think someone needs to have exactly my own path, but it's your feisty daughters that will survive in physical science.
That's great advice. I mean, it's because in order to make that change, sometimes you have to push back. And you can do it respectfully, but at the same time, though, it's certainly a big part of it is that speaking up and letting people know that it's not okay to have those views. So if there's no other comments, we can definitely go on to the next question too. And the one thing in our past episodes of the podcast that we did, we highlighted resources. I know all of you haven't shared some of your favorites in order just to encourage students, including women, to pursue careers in STEM. And after we just discussed, does there also need to be more emphasis placed on keeping women in STEM and not just about to get them to the universities and then they're good? Is there more that needs to be done? And feel free to jump in.
So one thing that I do think that is a decision that a lot of women deal with in STEM, and not just women, but families in general, I think that's shifting now, but is the decision to stay in the workforce when you do start a family. And FMLA in the United States, in my opinion, it's a joke. The standard of living, the cost of living for a middle-class family now almost requires for both parents to work full time. And so FMLA essentially allows you to be guaranteed that you will have a position to come back to should you choose to take family leave because you've had a child or you've adopted a child or some sort of life-changing event is occurring. But it doesn't guarantee you any salary, right? And a lot of employers will tell you when you ask, is there maternity leave here? Well, no, but we have FMLA. Well, first, it only kicks in after you've been employed there for a year. And so, as we all know, sometimes family planning is not that precise. And so you can find yourself in a situation where it won't kick in. And worse is that sometimes you have to make the decision, if I want to take 3 to 4 months off, can I do it without my pay? And a lot of families choose to a lot of women, I know a lot of colleagues have chosen to take very little time after having children because of that situation. Going back just a few weeks after, I've seen women come back 2 weeks after a C-section because of that. And so I think, our future, our children, and their mental well-being and sort of those first years through 1 through 3 are the most informative in a person's life that mold them into their adults. I think that's really a critical piece of the future, just national security of our country and our culture. And we don't emphasize that. We don't put an importance on that. And so we're forcing families to take on the burden of that to some degrees, and it's not fair. And you look at other countries, especially some of the Scandinavian countries that provide up to 2 years of family leave, both for the women or for the women, but also for fathers. We need to have a more comprehensive, basically, plan as a country to allow that to happen. Because I think what's happening a lot that I see is a lot of women just drop out of the workforce for a few years, and then they try to get back into it. And because you're in science and the fields evolve so rapidly, they're not hireable. People don't want to hire them because they feel they're behind. And so we need to fix that somehow. We need to have flexible plans for women to be able to take time off to be at home with their children and recuperate, but then also be able to come back, but also in a time range that's appropriate for when you've had a child and you've experienced something like that.
Absolutely. And, not making them not forcing them to make a decision between one or the other. Being able to be a professional as well as raising a family.
Yeah, and I would completely agree with that and add on, in addition to the requirement to be in a job for a year, there's almost nothing for graduate students. And a lot of times graduate students, that's really that's really a great time to have kids for a lot of people. That's when I had both of my kids. And for me, it was great in some ways because, once you're past classes, it does afford a lot of flexibility, but there was literally nothing built in. Even when I had a National Science Foundation fellowship, and at the time, there was literally nothing built in for what to do if you have a child. And so I literally was answering emails as I was in labor. I was answering emails and doing work days after. My advisor, in his congratulatory email for having my baby, also said, you should check out this latest paper. And within 3 weeks, I had my newborn baby strapped on my chest, and I was out in the field doing research again. And so, luckily I was doing field work at a location that was near enough to my home that I could keep my baby with me all the time. And then my advisor went on sabbatical. I don't think he'll listen to this. He went on sabbatical. And so I kept my baby in the office with me when I went into campus for a lot of times because I couldn't afford childcare. And so it's, really this big conversation, but I would say that doesn't just benefit women, that benefits men who are realizing how important it is to be an involved parent also. But aside from even the motherhood issues, for me, I spent a much longer amount of my career doing field work than I have in my current position so far. And I think really making intentional and uncomfortable efforts to make fieldwork safe for women. Luckily, I was always surrounded with wonderful people, but I know that a lot of women especially in geology and earth sciences and things like this, have had horrible experiences trying to do field work as a woman in a male-dominated place. There's often not accommodations. So, talking openly about the safety of women in the field is also important.
Now, speaking about, continuing with that conversation, in addition, we can obviously talk more about that, but also, do you think institutions need to change or revise their policies to foster a more supportive environment? We're obviously talking about leave for having children and all of that. But do you think that policies, even more than that, need to really change, both in academia, but also in the workplace itself?
I think that and I don't know if it's institution specific or it needs to be done on a more federal regulatory level. I think that there is a lot of differences between institutions in terms of even things like their tolerance of sexual harassment or sexual discrimination, even in the perception of that. I actually recently had a conversation with a colleague about what I thought I considered to be discrimination because we were women. And she said, "Oh, I don't think that's discrimination. I do notice that the men do get more opportunities and more recognition." And which I thought was really funny, because in her mind, she was still thinking discrimination has to be of a sexual nature. It has to be, somebody making you a passive comment about your looks or something, as opposed to just not getting similar opportunities. And I think that can sometimes be that the bar was set low for what we consider equality, and now the bar is higher. And especially with the Me Too movement, especially with the kind of recent politics in this country and the struggle that we're having. And so it's like redefining that threshold, that metric by which we consider ourselves equal and other people consider us equal, and making that sort of at a universal level across institutions, across academia, I think is kind of where we need to get in the next few years. And I think it's sort of a reawakening of the problem and a redefining of that problem. And so I think we still have work to do to get to that point, and to kind of make people aware that now those tiny discriminations are also discrimination. We've gotten this far, let's move it to the next level. I think we need to go there.
Yeah, we're not at the end of that quite yet, right? There's still a lot more ground that we have to cover. Absolutely.
Yeah, and I would say also adding layers of transparency in how decisions are made, who is at the table during those decisions, things like that. Because I have seen, while, like I've said before, I have a lot of very supportive colleagues and very open and aware of these issues, but there is still that kind of old boys network that you go out for beers and cigars and then a decision is made. And I'm not a beers and cigars person at all, but I have learned that sometimes I just need to go and sit in the midst of beers and cigars. And usually, the people that I work with are very welcoming. They're happy to have me there. We chat, we talk, and I realize how much is actually done at those kind of social gatherings after work, whether it be during business travel or at conferences or during field work. And so while, yes, they've let me into the old boys network, it's, not everybody would necessarily have that drive to, as Julie said, just kind of charge in and kick ass and show up at these meetings and make yourself, feel comfortable and do it. And so for those women who maybe aren't quite there, they should not be left out of those decision-making processes. So maybe formalizing that process instead of it being by a word of mouth, hey, you and I, let's go talk about this later tonight, formalizing these opportunities. Or, I don't know necessarily the answer, but I think, adding more transparency to how decisions are made will definitely help the workplace be more conducive to everybody feeling involved and as a contributor.
Yeah, and for maybe, male colleagues to consider these things. For example, if I have a program manager in DC that's male, can I go out for a drink with him and discuss things? My male colleagues can do that. Is it okay? Does it look right if I do that? I could go for a coffee, but how you kind of have those kind of one-on-one private conversations and how it's perceived, you have to be conscious, right?
And all of that plays a role. Absolutely. It's just, like you said, Jessica and Julie, that, it's, there's different set of roles that you have to deal with, that whether that is what the perception is or what is viewed as acceptable. And for those who are maybe not as take charge, who maybe are, they're just as smart as everybody else in that room, but maybe they just don't have that extra drive, or that personality, they shouldn't be left out of the room either, right? It needs to be that welcoming, that comfort level that exists in all workplaces, I think, so people don't feel on the periphery.
Yeah, and Julie, actually, you just brought up something that I think, in all honesty, no matter how supportive people are, is a huge issue for women, and that's interacting with male colleagues. Even if your male colleague is the most respectful and open, and even if everything is above board and everything is perfect, there are issues. For example, I am often the only woman traveling with a group of men. And I, work very hard to always, I don't go to, men might come downstairs in like sweats and whatever for a morning coffee to talk or whatever. No, I always make sure I am, presented in a way that would never, never compromise anything. But also, I have actually had wives of my colleagues be upset that I'm even there. And I have to basically hide in my hotel room outside of any formal like conference meeting or, very work hour thing. And that's how I end up missing some of these things, because I know that if I go there, I'm going to get strife or cause strife for my colleagues just because I'm a woman in a place that spouses might think is an all male environment. And, you have to be really, really, really aware of how you interact with people. And not only does that possibly prohibit you from taking advantage of professional opportunities, but it also is emotionally draining sometimes to constantly have to be guarding yourself and constantly have to be, kind of putting on a show or balancing these decisions about, if I go there, is it going to be perceived wrong? If I don't go there, am I going to be missing out on a professional opportunity? So yeah, that is actually something that I hadn't thought about. That is a huge factor as a woman and how I'm able to interact with my colleagues.
Yeah, I would also say that very often, because you're a woman, your accomplishments, the fact that you're a woman is used to marginalize your accomplishments, that you're getting recognized or special treatment because you're a woman, and the boss is a man, and so therefore he likes you just because of that, as opposed to, and so it sometimes calls into question your accomplishments. I'm not saying it happens all the time, but there's it's a thing that someone can pick on to bring you down a level because they don't understand why they didn't receive a particular award or recognition or an opportunity. It's because you're a woman. Or I've even had you were selected for this only because you're a minority and we want to project an image of inclusivity, so you were selected to participate in this program. And, I recently gave a speech for something else, and I brought that up as a comment that was given to me for something that I was nominated for. And one of the women in the audience raised her hand and said, fine, well, at least you were picked for that instead of because you were a white male. So it's our turn. So what? So why, that's your response to somebody when they tell you something like that. And it's true. Why should I apologize for that? And whether that is true or not, I'm happy to have the opportunity. But yeah, people use those things, and it's so ridiculous in a way to think that, but they use those things to bring you down or justify in their mind potentially as to why those opportunities aren't given to them. And it does weigh in on you, and it eats away at you, and it does create a little bit of self-doubt. Unfortunately, I'm one of those people who lets that kind of stuff get to me, whether it's true or not. It just is who I am, so.
That's too bad. I'm so sorry that's happening to you. That has not happened to me. And I think maybe the goal is to outperform your boss. Do it. Be better than your boss if he's male, and see how others take it. Don't be afraid. Even though I want people who are listening to this especially young ladies who are thinking about going into the field. Yes, there are some horror stories out there, but there are also some really good stories out there. I've been in academia most of my life. I've also worked for a couple of very well-known research institutes across the globe, and I've always been presented with equal opportunity. I have had nursing chambers set up for me across the university. I've had my office renovated so that I can nurse in private. I traveled 3,000 miles every month, 6,000 miles every month with the nursing paraphernalia, 2 years for both of my kids, and my work made it possible. So I was the highest ranked woman in my department. There are really success stories. And so you can break these barriers. You kiddos out there, you 19 through 30-year-olds, well, everybody's a kiddo to me. You can do this. There are really good things happening for women out there. Be aware that you might have some stumbles, but you can persevere.
And that's a wonderful sentiment. That's a wonderful sentiment, Karen. And thank you for saying that, because that's what the goal of this is to talk about some of the challenges, but also say that, you know, the progress is being made, right? And that's an important thing to remember. And at the same time, also highlights, you know, what we're talking about with the policies, where not everybody is at the same level. So is that there need to be more uniform policies or whatever, because there are some that are outperforming in that regard, right? And some that maybe aren't quite there. And I think to your point, Shauna, is that, yeah, a lot of this, what people are saying to detract from your accomplishments is a combination, I think, of a lack of self-awareness and realizing that you've had these opportunities. It's okay to let someone else have them. But I also think too is that with something like that, you know, it's like I said, just lack of self-awareness, unfortunately, and doing it unconsciously. I think, you know, whether that doesn't make it okay, but I think those are the moments that it's okay to have a platform. Doesn't matter how you got to that platform. It's okay to have that platform and then to use that to break those barriers, right? And I think, you know, we started talking a little bit about the male colleagues and some of the good and some of the bad, and that's what I want to talk to you about now. And being a man in the museum field, there's a lot that we can do to be better allies. And so what can professionals, especially male colleagues, do to help change the culture in these institutions, or to help continue the positive, you know, interactions, I should say, in the job field?
I would say it's being supportive and being aware and recognizing, I think, are sort of the main things. I will say I've had a lot of bad experiences, but I've actually had more great than bad, right? So, you know, for the most part, it is amazing to be a woman in the science field, and definitely a lot of fun. And so please, you know, don't hold back. I think the conversation is, there's still some change that needs to be made, but it's actually really good. And most of the male colleagues that I've worked with have been very supportive, even when I've had children, you know, trying to be flexible, working off hours, giving me writing assignments that I can do with a baby sitting next to me. But I think there are a lot of men who still are not aware enough, in my opinion. They don't necessarily see the problem that's right in front of them. And I've had experiences where you do bring something up and they're somewhat dismissive, like that's actually not that big of a deal, but then they're not dealing with it and they don't really see how it feels. So I think having all men, hopefully at some point get to the point where they recognize when things are hurtful or that they are subtly discriminating against other females, or when a woman comes to you with a problem, to be more receptive than dismissive, I think would help a lot. And I think most people are there. There's just still that lingering kind of group that always is around, that's the group that we need to kind of bring up. So HR departments consistently training and bringing that message and examples of what these they call them microaggressions now, but what those are to the surface, so that they start to get trained to recognize them, I think is very important.
Let's see. I'll jump in with a couple pieces of maybe of advice for for male colleagues. I mean, one is that if you want diversity, gender or other diversity, you have to be intentional about it, right? You can't just look at the candidate pool. You actually have to go out, and seek it and look for those people who are special and help bring them up. And then the other thing is, Shauna just pointed out that, not all people know when something's hurtful, but, and hearing the things that have been said to our faces, can you imagine the things that are said in meetings where we're not there? But believe me, in every one of those meetings, there's probably one guy who knows that it's not right. And that person can choose to just be like, and you don't have to make a big deal about it. You can be like, hey, that's not cool. We don't do that here, and move on. But if there's that reinforcement, that, you can learn from diversity trainings, but you can also learn from like being mildly shamed by your colleagues. And it's a very effective strategy.
I do that every once in a while in group meetings. I'll say, hey guys, that's and I'll start laughing. Doesn't that kind of border on maybe sexual harassment? Because I'm a woman and I'm the only woman here. And then, I laugh, ha, 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 but they get it. They get it. A little prod here and there.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say sorry.
No, I was just going to say, and I think it's something to also say for men taking consideration other men as well. Like, I know that sounds weird, but also understanding that it's not just a men to women sexual harassment, but men can do it to men, and you know what I mean? Like, it's not just eliminating it from conversations altogether in the workplace, right? It's that level of professionalism we hope to reach.
Yeah, and I would say in addition, outside of the harassment realm, a lot of these changes that women and minorities are pushing for in the workplace really benefit everybody. And so don't see it as a divisive, they're coming for us and all that we've earned issue. See it as, we're all going to do this together. We're all going to make this a better workplace. We're going to give you the opportunity. You want to coach your kids' baseball team? I say that. Actually, that's funny, because I say that thinking of something that a guy might benefit from, but I actually coached my son's baseball team. So any parent, you want to coach your kid's baseball team. Well, now you don't have to be ashamed to say, you know what, I'm going to come in a little earlier and leave a little bit earlier because I want to be more engaged in my kid's life. Do you want to participate in a local band? Maybe it's not a parenting thing, and you would like to have more flexible hours to dedicate yourself to that interest to be more balanced. Well, guess what? These flexibility policies that help women will also help you have a more balanced life also. And, I think that while men can definitely benefit from the outcomes of this, they need to see that early on and jump on the board and help to promote these changes early as well, to not make them divisive issues, but really make it for the betterment of our society, which sounds, super pie in the sky, but one step at a time, right?
No, that's a great point, right? It's that is the goal. That is the ultimate goal. It is to all look at each other as a team, and some places do it better than others, and not look at everything having to be a competition. There's enough for everyone, and it's okay to be supportive and happy for someone else's success, because that does help you, especially if you're in the same institution or same organization. That makes you all stronger. That breeds that success. And I think, as we wind down, I want to talk about what you hope listeners, people listening to this right now, what do you hope they take away from this conversation that we're having?
Yeah, I will say, first of all, thank you, Karen, for always reminding us that, yes, it is a wonderful thing to be a woman in STEM. And that, of course, on this, I think talking about some of our challenges will help young women who maybe have faced challenges to understand they're not alone. But hopefully exposing some of our experiences will also show you that there is a whole community of people, us, women that are there, but also as you've noticed, there's a lot of allies that don't look like us and that don't have the life experience of us that will support you and are open. So I think the key thing is just to find your people and be true to yourself. And all of us sounds like we've done that, and we've had our people, and we've been true to ourselves, and luckily here we are able to tell our story. But yeah, there are stories, but there is a huge network of people that are looking for, wherever you come from, they are looking for you if you have a spark for STEM fields.
It's true. And people put other people down for different reasons, whether they're white, black, female, male, whatever, because it makes them feel better. It makes them feel better, right? We're all guilty of that. And don't let those snarkinesses, those microaggressions that occur not just because you're a woman, but also because you're short, tall, black, white, green, or blue, don't let those stand in your way. I love Jessica's suggestion. Find your people, find your support system, and go for it. And find a mentor, whether it's a male mentor or a female mentor or both, or your parents or somebody else that really can support you. Find those people and let them be your support system and mentors. And if nothing else, there's the four of us. You can contact us.
Yeah, we've covered some great territory in this chat. So, lots of good little topics we got to. But thank you for the opportunity, and it's been lovely to chat with everybody.
Yeah, same here. Thanks for bringing us together. I think it's very important that we have this conversation and that these conversations continue. And I think what I hope the listeners take away from this is that we're for science, women in the science field. I find myself that this particular field is very gratifying, that I love what I do every day. I love going to work. Well, I mean, right now, none of us are really going to work. We're all doing video, but, I love what I do every day. I love the science that I've chosen, the passion that it brings. I'm never bored. And so I would never want anybody to hold back from that and for pursuing that and the things that interest them. But as everyone has said, there have been so many who have come before us. There will be so many after, and we are all here, and we are all a network. And the science community as a whole is a very accepting, it's a very positive, and a very fun place to work. And there are challenges in this field, and there are challenges in every other field. But do what you like, and there will be struggles in anything you choose to do. But if you like it, it'll be worth it. And progress is progress, and we're moving forward. So thank you very much for this opportunity for us to talk about all these issues and help to kind of, in some ways, normalize them to help make them better. So yes, thank you.
Thank you all. And I'll just throw in, something I had said earlier, and this is what I really hope, especially for this roundtable, which is a little different than we normally do, where we normally have the one-on-one. But with this roundtable, my goal is, it's always about inspiring the young students who want to get into STEM. This one, specifically about young women, but also knowing that some teachers and parents and guardians will listen to this and understanding that it's not enough to get them. There's so much other support that they'll need on that path, and they'll need that guidance beyond just those years in academia, but also even out. They might come to you and say, I'm dealing with this. And being there for them and being supportive even after once they get into the field, that's super important. And that was really the goal of this conversation, is to say, strides have been made, no question. But these are also things to keep an eye on and understand that there's still so much ahead. And so I want to thank you all so much for taking the time to speak with me today about this. And thank you to everyone out there listening to this podcast. Now, if you'd like to learn more about our institutions, you can visit our websites at nationalatomictestingmuseum.org, dri.edu, healthynv.org, llnl.gov, nsri.nebraska.edu, and ornl.gov. And don't worry, we will have those in the YouTube description. So we will have all of those links available for you. So if you're furiously writing them down, don't worry, they'll be in the description. Now, and you can also find the NATM on Facebook and Twitter by searching Atomic Museum. And thank you again, and have a wonderful day. Thank you so much, everyone.